Netanyahu was of American origin. I mean, the late Netanyahu, brother of,
The brother, yeah.
yeah, exactly, Benjamin Netanyahu's brother. So what I'm saying is the Americans love to bask in the success of their client states, particularly after Vietnam, when they felt a need for client states. So I'd say the US is really the wild card in this, not Israel. Israel is doing what it feels it must.
Welcome to the Gist on Stratnewsglobal. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Gist. As we are looking at the situation in Lebanon, Israel, Gaza, and I have with me Prem Mahadevan. He's a researcher on intelligence. He's also the author of a very good book on Mossad called Spies in the Sand. Prem Mahadevan, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you, sir. Honor to be here.
Prem, we've had Yahya Sinwar's death. There's a lot of talk that perhaps there could be a dialogue with Hamas, perhaps some kind of peace could prevail, maybe even a ceasefire. What is your sense?
So I believe there's a kind of a war of narratives going on between the Americans and the Israelis on this one. So the Americans are putting out the narrative that Sinwar was the problem. And this is typical of them, actually. They always make it out that, a huge issue can be reduced to one man. Russia, eventually, it's all down to Putin. And in the past, it has all been Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. And previously, it was some other, strong man who was opposing them. So the Americans tend to always reduce everything to one individual. And when that individual is out of the picture in some way or the other, then there's a new opportunity. We start all over. The Israelis are countering that with a narrative of systemic threat. So they are basically saying now, if you look at the Israeli media, they're already suggesting that Hezbollah is recovering from the pager blasts, that Nasrallah's death has not been crippling for Hezbollah. So I see a kind of maneuvers going on here in the discursive field, with the Americans trying to say this is a window of opportunity for Israel to call it quits from a position of strength and to impose terms. And the Israelis are basically looking for even better terms in the future. So they are keeping open the option of not just continuing with the ground operations, but possibly escalating them. So I'm not sure that there's unity or uniformity of discourse on this. I think there are different interest groups pulling in different directions.
You expect Netanyahu to have his way?
It comes down to timing, sir. We must remember there's a very heavily watched US election that's around the corner. And speculation is that Netanyahu wants to lock in terms which will be favorable, highly favorable to Israel, so that thereafter, whoever comes into power just has to deal with those. So, I mean, from that perspective, he's got a window of opportunity. And yes, why should he then give it up? Just because Sinwar's out of the way now. They're already saying that it's about releasing the hostages, the release of the hostages. But if you look at some of the reports that come out of Israel, the hostages' families do feel that they're not being very, closely heard by the administration. So I think, there's always going to be the argument that Hamas is a threat. And let's not forget what happened on October 7th last year was monstrous. So Israel has every right to be traumatized by that. Any country would. But the question is then how much you can leverage that trauma for some larger strategic benefit years, which will telescope years into the future. So I think that's what's going on here. Probably, I think Netanyahu is confident that he can handle the Americans. I mean, he's the longest serving Israeli prime minister. And even the Americans themselves know this. He's confident that he knows how to deal with them. He's lived there. He thinks that he's got the measure of these people and they're not very bright. So he can pull wool over their eyes. And at least that's how the Americans themselves perceive Netanyahu's view of them.
What's your sense of Hamas and Hezbollah? Are they finished? Are they decimated, destroyed? Can they come back?
So in the short term, it's very hard to imagine how they can come back. I mean, Hamas and Hezbollah are not exactly the same. Of course, Hezbollah is supposed to have greater operational depth, but then again, they were, decimated by the pager blasts, from what I've read. That was far more damaging, I think, than Nasrallah's death. Having said that, no, I think the Israelis are going to face a peculiar intelligence challenge going ahead. When you eliminate all the top leadership in one go, you clear the way for newbies to come on the scene, people who are not really known to you, whose
Yeah.
personalities and inclinations are not known to you. You can't really predict strategically then how any future engagement with these people is going to evolve, because you don't know their personalities. And I think we can't overlook the importance of personality here. I mean, by all accounts, Yahya Sinwar was very important in terms of Hamas's position vis-a-vis Israel, and he was very confident that he understood the Israeli mindset. So I think what the Israelis are going to have to deal with is, yeah, they're certainly going to be in a strong position for the short term and probably the medium term. In the long term, it's difficult to say because you've cleared the space now for all these new guys to appear on the scene, and you don't really know which way they will go in terms of engagement with Israel or further confrontation. And the international situation is also in a state of flux. We must remember that.
What do you think Israel wants to do in Gaza? What's the game plan there?
According to some of what I've read, the Israelis themselves are not sure there is a game plan. It's as if there's no real objective other than to utterly decimate and destroy Hamas. That's understandable in light of the carnage that was inflicted on Israel. But
Yeah.
then, reoccupy the territory or completely, reduce it and then force the people there to live on the edge of survival such that they have no time to focus on planning attacks on Israel. Then also, what is the question of the West Bank? I mean, the two-state solution, we all know Netanyahu is dead opposed to it. I
Yeah.
mean, that is clear. But I mean, what exactly is the position of the Israeli mainstream on this? Now, there have been reports, I mean, that some Israelis are sufficiently alienated by the rightward trend in politics in their country that they themselves are emigrating out of the country. They feel that Israel is not the same Israel that they served in the past, that they were proud to serve, and so on. So I think we're talking about political shifts actually in Israel, but also in the countries around Israel. I mean, one factor which is not talked about is the extreme hostility that is being directed at Israel now from the populations of its neighboring countries. It's being muted. There isn't too much amplification of this in international media. But just some time ago, a Jordanian killed 3 Israeli border guards, and this was nothing to do with Iran. This was just
Yeah.
um, anger against Israel. So, I mean, that is going to be a bigger challenge as well. How does Israel now deal with the fact that any goodwill at a people-to-people level is gone for the foreseeable future?
Tell me, the hostages. Much of Gaza has been reduced to rubble. There's no sign of the hostages. There are about 90 or 100 of them, I'm told. Um, what's the sense of where they're going with the hostages? Or they don't matter?
It's difficult to say. So, I mean, obviously, it comes down to intelligence, as in where they are being held, and but then
Yeah.
there's the larger question as well: how much does the life of a victim of a terror victim matter to a state? And this includes a state like Israel, which supposedly says that every life is precious, far more so
Yeah.
than because of their tragic history. Uh, it's very easy sometimes to amplify an individual tragedy to the point where you try to achieve statecraft objectives through it. And I mean, I'm not quite sure actually what the Israeli position really is on this, because if you look at it, I'll give you an example. There are reports coming out from the Washington Post, from Der Spiegel, that Israeli border guards, there was a all-female unit of Israeli border guards, border scouts, who were monitoring the Hamas buildup and who
Mhm.
sent warnings up the chain of command. And they were told by their bosses, who were male bosses, and there seems to have been some male chauvinism here. They were basically told by their bosses, superior officers, to shut up. They were told, we know the bigger picture, you don't, everything's under control. Now, the thing is, most interestingly, from what I've read, some of these women were warned that if they continued to deliver warnings to the chain of command, that an attack was imminent, they would be arrested and jailed. Now that,
Mhm.
from an intelligence perspective, is horrific. You don't
Yeah.
you don't threaten someone who's trying to warn you of an impending attack by saying, "Don't tell me what I don't want to hear," or you go to jail. So what I'm trying to say is that it's really difficult to know how much the tragedy of the hostages, and it is a tragedy for them and their families, how much is that a tragedy at the level of the state, the impersonal bureaucracy that is used to dealing with deaths, as whether it's of Israelis or others, as eventually some kind of macabre statistic.
And you don't think the it's become a big political issue there? It's not enough to push Netanyahu into, some kind of deal on the hostages.
The way I see it, I mean, Netanyahu is in a strong position now, and there has been speculation that he is trying to go for a Churchillian, image in history. He snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Of course, in the actual Churchill's case, it was Chamberlain,
Yeah.
who had the defeat, and then Churchill comes along and produces the victory. In Netanyahu's case, he's got the inconvenient fact that he himself was in power when October 7th happened, so he has to deliver really impressive coups, which, to be fair, he is managing to do right now, especially with the Hezbollah, with the pager bombings in Lebanon. Um, so I'm not quite sure what kind of political pressure he would be under. From what I've read, he's not very popular. I mean, some would argue that's even an understatement, but his government is not unstable, so he can afford to brazen it out. And we must remember, at the end of the day, this guy has been around. He's seen American presidents come and go. So
Yeah.
I think he's a survivor. Let me put it like that.
Mm. And what's your sense of Israel's intelligence capabilities? October 7th last year was a massive failure by any account, and they appear to have made up a lot of lost ground.
Indeed, but this is the interesting thing about Israel. If you look at it, I mean, we start with, let's go back a little back in history. Pearl Harbor, considered a huge intelligence failure. Then 6 months later, the Americans produce a significant success at the Battle of Midway. It does
Yeah.
seem to be the case that even with Israel, Yom Kippur, big intelligence failure, then military victory, a rather
Yeah.
impressive one considering they were surprised actually.
Mm.
Um, I would say that with Israel, they're certainly showing a lot of style now, a lot of panache. So all credit to them for that. Uh, I think this is the assessment I've got, that because a lot of their policy makers are themselves experts on national security, the intelligence community does seem to face a challenge in terms of competing for attention and competing to put its own ideas, its own hypotheses, or its own projections out there. I mean, in the case of Yitzhak Rabin, for example, he firmly believed that intelligence agencies should only give him the facts. I mean, he was an ex chief of the IDF, so he felt that he could interpret those facts himself. He didn't need Mossad or anyone else to do it for him. So, and with Netanyahu himself, of course, ex military, former special forces. So, when you have that kind of confidence, there is, I think, a risk of politicization of intelligence. It's built into the system. Now, that does mean that Israel can run the risk sometimes. I won't say it happens always, but sometimes Israel can run the risk of being surprised when there is a policy consensus on something, and that leads to groupthink, which can affect the intelligence agencies. Then a surprise can occur, and then to recover from that, Mossad or any other intelligence agency will do what it's best at, which is operations. Specific covert operations, special operations. So they've been trying to recover lost ground, I think, by playing to their strengths, which is actually in the operational sphere, particularly covert strikes.
And they would have had help from the US, of course.
The Israelis have maneuvered themselves rather smartly into saying that your enemies are our enemies and vice versa. So, it's very hard to imagine that anyone in the US is terribly distressed by the covert strikes that are being attributed to Israel, especially against Hezbollah, or for that matter, against Iran. I mean, let's look at the mysterious killings of Iranian scientists. I
Yeah.
mean, these, at the end of the day, these are, yes, they are working on defense plans, but they are civilians, and they're, the fact that they're being killed on their home territory, and no one's really talking about this. this suggests that there's a kind of an international view about who can get away with what. And I think the US here very much, I mean, Israel is doing what it has to. I mean, fair play to them. They're in a very dire strategic situation. But it's the US here which is really, I think, deciding to who to support, whose activities to ignore, and whose activities to condemn for any flimsy reason whatsoever.
Which direction do you see this war in Lebanon going now?
I think from what I've read, sir, there's speculation that Netanyahu could be, and this is just speculation, he could be trying to do a deal with the US wherein he somewhat waters down Israel's response to the Iranian attack in return for Hezbollah accepting Israeli terms in Lebanon and Hamas capitulating totally. So, I think right now the idea of opening multiple fronts is not to prevail on all, but to link all of them to Iran and then try to see how you can neutralize the non-state threats while keeping the state threats for the future, for waiting for them to be further isolated. Because eventually, Iran is, as I see it, Iran is Israel's trump card.
Yeah.
Everything has to be reduced to Iran in the end. You can't there after Iran is sort of neutralized. You can't talk about Russia or China being the next threat to Israel.
Yeah.
So Iran, as I see it, has to be kept as the ultimate bogey, as something which will keep the Americans on side, come what may. Because I mean, if Kamala Harris, for example, saying that Iran is the number one threat to the United States. Now that kind of nonsensical talk, of course, plays very well in certain quarters. It's illogical, but it serves strategic purposes to have that um, relayed, if let's say.
Mhm. Do you anticipate a strike on Iran? Netanyahu has vowed he will do so.
From everything that I've read, a strike is likely to happen, but what form it takes and which
Yeah.
targets are hit and so on, I mean, that's the open question. So, yeah, I mean, even if you look at it, as I understand, some international flights are avoiding Iranian airspace because they don't know
Yeah.
when they'll be, cruising and there'll be a missile flying alongside them. So, I think the general expectation is that something is going to happen, but then what form it will take is unclear. Also, the United States, I would suggest, is playing a very finely balanced double game here. Last Sunday,
Mhm.
for example, they sent a letter to Israel arguing that Israel had to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, or else the Americans might cut off some military assistance. And then that letter is very conveniently leaked to the media.
Mm.
So that makes you wonder that I mean, from some of the commentaries I've read, people believe that that's just nonsense. They're just posturing for the sake of keeping some of the Arab world on side by saying, look, we are trying to restrain them, we're doing our best. But they're not really putting their full weight behind it. So I would argue that one really, when one tries to look at the conflict dynamic, the key element is not Israel. Israel is genuinely believes it is doing what it has to survive. The key element is the United States here. That is the variable which one has to keep in mind. And I'll explain why, sir, if I may, very quickly.
Yeah.
During the Cold War, there was a fine balance where the United States supported Israel and the Soviet Union supported the Arabs, including the Palestinian cause. The Madrid process only took off because of the fact that the Soviets signed on to it just before the collapse of the Union in 1991. Otherwise, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. The Americans had to bring the Soviets on board as the Arab and the Palestinian patron. But what happened was that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Americans were the only game in town. And they tried to appear as if they were credible and acceptable to both sides, but their long term, I wouldn't say, I mean, their long term orientation has been towards Israel.
Yeah.
Now, the Americans have zero credibility with the Arab world. And as a result, and also let's not forget their humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan,
Yeah.
which has significantly undermined their image of strength and unipolarity, as has the war in Ukraine. These guys are looking to send a message out that they are still a power to reckon with. And Israel is very conveniently and very usefully serving that purpose. It's using American weapons. It's amplifying the fact that if you've got the United States behind you, you can act like a regional superpower. So that actually rebounds to the credit of the Americans. The way they, for example, rushed to take joint credit for the Entebbe strike. If you look in
Yeah.
1976, if you look at media reports, the Americans almost made it out as if it was a joint operation between them and the Israelis. You know, Netanyahu was of American origin. I mean, the late Netanyahu, the
Mm.
brother of
The brother, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Benjamin Netanyahu's brother. So what I'm saying is the Americans love to bask in the success of their client states, particularly after Vietnam, when they felt a need for client states. So I'd say the US is really the wild card in this, not Israel. Israel is doing what it feels it must.
Hmm. And would you say Iran has lost credibility, lost ground there? I mean, even Khamenei was taken to a safe place.
I think Iran is definitely beleaguered now. It can feel it is under threat. Credibility. I mean, one has to remember that Iran was able to exploit the American mistakes in Iraq. That's how it really managed to expand its power and become very influential in the region. Uh, I would say that we have not yet fully seen what the Iranians are capable of doing. And that I think is because there's still an international realignment going on, and the Iranians are not sure actually how things will play out with the US. So they're holding back a little bit. One of the concerns that I have, well, sort of hypothesizing, is of a major terrorist strike in a third country.
Hmm.
One cannot assume that this capability doesn't exist. Yes, a lot of such strikes have been thwarted. The Israelis have revealed that there were attacks planned against Jews and against Israeli citizens overseas, which have been thwarted, often with the help of local authorities. So that's definitely to Israel's credit and to the credit of those authorities. But you can't be assured that there won't be something in the future if they outflank you, which they might be able to do. Um, then that would come as a strategic surprise again. So I would not say the Iranians have lost credibility. We simply don't know what their actual capabilities are. There are, of course, talk that they've been heavily penetrated by Israel. I certainly would agree that there are some signs of that penetration. But this is not, Iran is one opponent that I think everyone would have to be careful of in the region. It has managed to weather a tremendous amount of trauma through the revolution, and it's got a certain strength to it, which is rather, I would argue, beyond a point. It's not easily reducible.
Hmm. But its proxy Hezbollah has been battered, and they've done very little to shore up support for that group.
Indeed, and that has caused a certain amount of resentment as well. So I would say that one could definitely argue that Iran has had to be on the back foot, but whether that is going to stay this way
Mm.
or whether there's going to be a reversal, that remains to be seen. Because at the end of the day, for what, no matter how many successes are there against militants or terrorists or whatever expression one uses, and one has to start being careful here, because sometimes, like, Hezbollah is not considered a terrorist group by some countries.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so when we're looking at Iran's proxy capabilities, yes, they have been weakened, and Hezbollah certainly. But then again, let's not forget Israel's strengths or Israel's successes against Hezbollah are all linked to combat zones and combat operations. Take
Yeah.
that out of the picture, and then how good, how would Israel stack up vis-a-vis Hezbollah, especially in a country where local authorities are not supportive
Hmm.
of Israel?
Okay, I come to my, I think, last question. Where do you see India's role here? Are we a player? Should we stay out? We seem to be staying out pretty well.
Sir, it would certainly be in India's interest to stay out. This is not India's fight. Definitely, I think there has to, and there is sympathy and for Israel on account of being a victim of barbaric attacks. But then again, there is also awareness of the tremendous suffering caused to the Palestinians, and one can't be heartless and deny that that is happening. So I would argue that India's best interests would be to stay out, to hope for a de-escalation, for a resolution of this issue somehow, but in the fullness of time. What India can do, however, is, and because India is an information power, I mean, India is being heard internationally, it can look to amplify multiple perspectives. It doesn't need to just present one side, which, because the Indian news media in particular often relies on the West for
Yeah,
its raw
heavily.
information. And I would
Yeah.
argue that, if one looks at, say, Russian perspectives or Arab perspectives and says we treat everyone equally, we are not going to, we're not going to play favorites here, then India can also develop credibility as a neutral party. Because otherwise, there will always be those who would argue that for ideological reasons, India should support one side simply
Hmm.
because it gels with their own personal politics.
Yeah. So keep out and stay safe. Is it? That's the message.
Keep out, stay safe, but stay very well informed, because at the end of the day, India's oil interests are linked to the Middle East. So
Yeah.
India cannot afford to be caught unawares by what is happening, and nor can it afford to ignore the great power dynamics. I mean, for example, studying US Israeli dynamics could be very interesting in terms of understanding the mindset of the United States, particularly now that that American unipolarity is being exceptionally challenged in a manner that it hasn't been since 1991. So, reading American insecurities and being able to decipher how that would translate into, say, US India relations, that could perhaps come through monitoring the US Israeli relationship.
And as we head into a US election, I guess things are going to get more complicated as time goes forward.
Indeed, sir. But I mean, that, to be honest, that's the Americans' problem. In all
Yeah,
India
it
can
is.
do is just observe and hedge its bets. That's all.
Yeah. Prem Mahadevan, thanks very much for that analysis and excellent perspective you've given us. I look forward to another chat with you at some other point in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Great speaking with you.
That's all we have for you on this edition of The Gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good day.